Nobody yells at Shohei Ohtani. That is not a rule written anywhere. It is not in the collective bargaining agreement or the organizational handbook or the unwritten code that governs how professional baseball players interact with each other in the compressed, high-pressure environment of a major league clubhouse. It doesn't need to be written anywhere. Because it is the kind of thing that everyone inside that world understands instinctively, the way certain boundaries don't require signs because their existence is self-evident to anyone paying attention. You don't yell at the person who carries the franchise on his shoulders every fifth day. You don't dismiss the counsel of someone who has forgotten more about pitching than most people in that building will ever know. You don't make the mistake of confusing your own frustration with a license to direct that frustration at the most respected player in the organization. Charlie Barnes made all three mistakes. In the same inning. In front of witnesses. And by the time the dust settled, by the time the Dodgers GM had made the announcement that the baseball world was already anticipating from the moment the story broke, Barnes was gone. And Ohtani had said something to the assembled media that stopped every person in that room cold. Not because it was angry. Because it wasn't. Barnes had been on the roster as a reclamation project. That is the honest description. Not cruel, reclamation projects are legitimate organizational strategies, and the Dodgers have executed them successfully enough that the approach carries institutional credibility. A pitcher with a history of solid performance whose numbers have declined for identifiable mechanical or situational reasons, brought into an environment with elite coaching infrastructure and given the resources to rediscover what made him effective. It works. Regularly. The Dodgers have made it work often enough that other organizations study their methodology. Barnes had arrived with genuine optimism attached to his name. His stuff, evaluated in isolation from his recent results, still carried the markers of a functional major league arm. The fastball had lost velocity but retained movement. The breaking ball, when he commanded it, generated the kind of swing-and-miss rates that suggested the pitch itself remained a weapon even if the delivery had drifted from the mechanical precision that made it reliable. The coaching staff had identified specific adjustments. Had communicated them clearly. Had given Barnes the film, the data, the one-on-one instruction time that the organization extends to every pitcher in its system with the genuine investment of people who believe in the work. The problem was that Barnes had stopped believing in the work before the work had time to produce results. And that impatience, that specific, corrosive quality of a veteran who has been told to change and has quietly decided that the change is the problem rather than the solution, had been visible for weeks to people watching closely enough to see it. Ohtani had seen it. Of course he had. Because Ohtani watches everything. Processes everything. Files observations about his teammates with the same systematic attention he brings to opposing lineups and pitching tendencies and the 100 other variables that he synthesizes in real time during the course of a baseball game. He had watched Barnes in his bullpen sessions. Had watched the mechanical drift, the subtle but consistent deviation from the adjusted release point the coaches had identified as the key to restoring the command that Barnes had lost. Had watched the breaking ball flatten at precisely the moments when Barnes was under pressure, which is when a breaking ball needs to be sharpest and when a pitcher's commitment to his mechanics matters most. He had said something. Not publicly. Not in the formal channels of organizational feedback. In the way that teammates sometimes speak to each other when one of them sees something that the other needs to hear, directly, privately, with the specific authority of someone who has earned the right to say hard things because the quality of his attention and the depth of his knowledge are beyond dispute. He had told Barnes what he was seeing. He had been specific. Had described the mechanical deviation in precise terms. Had connected what he was observing in the bullpen to what Barnes had been experiencing in games, the loss of late movement, the inability to locate the breaking ball to the arm side corner, the specific mechanical cause of the results that had been compiling against him. Barnes had listened. And then he had told Ohtani, in language that several people present described as startling in its directness and its disrespect, that he didn't need advice from a position player. That phrase, position player, landed in the room the way certain phrases land when they reveal something the speaker intended to conceal. When the word someone chooses to dismiss you expose, more clearly than any direct statement could, exactly how they see you and what they believe about your relationship to the thing you love most. Ohtani is not primarily a position player. He is not primarily anything. He is the only person in the history of professional baseball to sustain elite performance as both a starting pitcher and an offensive contributor at the major league level simultaneously. He has forgotten more about pitching mechanics than Barnes learned in his entire professional career. The idea that his counsel on a mechanical issue was the intervention of someone who didn't understand the craft was not just wrong. It was insulting in a way that went beyond Barnes and extended to everyone in that clubhouse who understood what Ohtani actually is. The witnesses to the exchange did not react immediately. That is the specific quality of shock that arrives when something happens that so completely violates the expected boundaries of an environment that the people inside it need a moment to confirm that what they just saw actually occurred. And then the reaction came. It came from multiple directions simultaneously. Veterans who had been in that clubhouse long enough to have developed the specific proprietary loyalty that close teams develop, who had watched Ohtani prepare and compete and carry weight and conduct himself with a dignity and professionalism that set a standard for everyone around him, felt something ignite that was not going to be easily managed. One player, a veteran whose name has not been confirmed in the reporting, stepped toward Barnes with the specific body language of someone who has decided that a line has been crossed and that the crossing requires a response. Another moved to intercept. Not to defend Barnes. To prevent the situation from escalating past the point where it could be contained within the walls of the clubhouse and managed through the organizational channels that exist precisely for moments like this. The room was loud for approximately 90 seconds. And then Ohtani spoke. He didn't raise his voice. That is the detail that every witness mentioned first, independently, when they described what happened. In a room that had gone loud with the specific heat of collective offense taken on behalf of someone who had not asked for anyone to take offense on his behalf, Ohtani's voice arrived at a register that required the room to quiet itself in order to hear it. And the room quieted. He said, "It's fine." 2 words. Delivered with the particular quality of calm that is not the absence of feeling but the complete management of it. The calm of someone who has decided, in real time, in the middle of a situation designed to produce the opposite, that the version of himself who responds with anger is not the version he is going to allow to exist in this moment. Then he said, "Let him pitch his way." He turned and walked back to his locker. The room stayed quiet for a long moment after he left it. Barnes took the mound in the 5th inning of a game the Dodgers needed. Everything Ohtani had identified, every mechanical deviation, every loss of release point precision, every flattened breaking ball that arrived in the zone without the late movement that made it a weapon, materialized in real time over the course of 23 pitches that will not appear in any highlight package but that the people watching from the dugout will remember for a long time. The first hitter worked a full count and hit a double to the gap in left center on a breaking ball that started at the hitter's hip and stayed there, flat, hittable, exactly the pitch that Ohtani had described in the conversation Barnes had dismissed. The second hitter hit a 2-run single on a fastball that caught the middle of the plate at a velocity that would have been adequate if the location had been sharp enough to compensate for it. It wasn't. By the time Roberts emerged from the dugout to end the inning and collect the baseball from Barnes, the damage was done. Not just on the scoreboard, though the scoreboard damage was real and consequential in the context of a game the Dodgers had been positioned to win. But in the more durable way that certain moments damage things, which is that everyone present understood with complete clarity that what they had just watched was the direct consequence of a pitcher rejecting counsel that would have prevented it. Barnes handed the ball to Roberts without speaking. Roberts said nothing. He turned and walked back to the dugout. The GM's announcement came the following morning. It arrived in the form of a transaction wire entry, clean, official, procedurally impersonal in the way that DFA announcements are always procedurally impersonal regardless of the human circumstances surrounding them. Charlie Barnes. Designated for assignment. The organizational statement that accompanied it was brief. Professional. It thanked Barnes for his time with the organization and wished him well in his next opportunity. It contained nothing that acknowledged the incident. Nothing that explained the timing. Nothing that connected the announcement to the specific sequence of events that had produced it. But nobody in the baseball world required the explanation. The timeline was clear enough. The sequence was documented enough. The relationship between what had happened in that clubhouse and what appeared on the transaction wire the following morning required no elaboration. He had rejected Ohtani's advice. He had yelled at Ohtani. He had gone out and demonstrated, in 23 pitches in a game that mattered, exactly why the advice he rejected was correct. And he was gone. The media availability that afternoon drew more reporters than the standard post-transaction session typically attracts. Everyone understood that the official story, the transaction wire language, the brief organizational statement, was not the full story. And everyone understood that what Robert said in that room would be the closest thing to a full accounting that the organization was willing to provide. Roberts entered with the composed, forward-looking energy of a manager who has resolved something and is ready to discuss the resolution without relitigating the events that made it necessary. He confirmed the DFA. He confirmed that the decision had been made at the organizational level with input from the coaching staff and the front office. He said the standard things about roster flexibility and competitive requirements and the ongoing evaluation of every player on the team. And then a reporter asked the question that everyone in the room had been building toward. The reporter said, "There are multiple accounts suggesting that Barnes had a significant confrontation with Ohtani before his last outing. That he rejected Ohtani's mechanical advice and directed language at him that was considered disrespectful by players present. Can you address that?" Roberts looked at the reporter for a long moment. Then said, "I can tell you that the culture of this clubhouse, the standard of conduct that we hold ourselves to, the way we treat each other, the way we receive input from our teammates, is something I take seriously. More seriously than any individual roster decision. When that standard is violated, we address it. We addressed it." The reporter pressed, "Did Ohtani's counsel to Barnes turn out to be correct? Based on what Barnes did on the mound?" Roberts said, "I think the results speak clearly enough that I don't need to add to them." Another reporter asked, "How did Ohtani respond to the DFA announcement?" Roberts was quiet for a moment. Then said, "He asked me if Barnes was going to be okay. Whether he would get another opportunity somewhere. That was his first question." The room absorbed that. Roberts continued, "His second question was about the next start. Who was available in the bullpen? What the rotation situation looked like going forward. He moved on. That's what he does. He moves on." Ohtani's media availability that day was brief. He answered questions about his upcoming start. About his pitch sequencing preparation. About the Dodgers' competitive position in the division. And then, near the end, a reporter asked the question directly. He said, "Can you tell us what happened with Barnes? In your own words?" Ohtani listened to the translation. His expression was the expression of someone deciding how much of a private thing to make public. Then he said, through his interpreter, "I saw something in his mechanics that I thought was causing problems. I shared what I saw." He didn't want to hear it. That happens. Not everyone wants to receive what you're offering, even when you're offering it because you want to help. The reporter asked, "Were you angry when he rejected it?" Ohtani said, "No." The reporter asked, "Were you angry when he yelled at you?" Ohtani considered this for a slightly longer moment. Then said, "I was disappointed. There's a difference." He picked up his bag. Then added one final thing. The thing that stopped the room. The thing that traveled furthest across the baseball world when the accounts of that afternoon were written and published and shared. He said, "I hope he finds someone who can help him. Because the stuff is still there. He just has to be willing to listen." He walked out. And in the quiet that followed, in the specific, weighted silence of a room full of people who had just witnessed something that reframed everything they thought they understood about the story they had come to cover, nobody moved for a long moment. Because what Ohtani had just demonstrated was not what anyone expected from someone who had been yelled at, dismissed, and publicly disrespected by a teammate whose career he had tried to save. He had demonstrated grace. Complete. Uncomplicated. Entirely genuine. The kind that doesn't require an audience and doesn't perform itself for one. The kind that simply exists. Because the person it belongs to has never needed the world's behavior to determine his own.